Okay, welcome back. This is a continuation of my breakdown of explaining why it is I say the Bible is based on mythology and not literal events. And again, I'm not telling you what to believe, I'm just giving you my take and where I'm at right now. So I said I would go into more of the stories, and we're going to take a look at a lot of the biblical stories to see how they connect to a lot of ancient mythology that is outside of the Bible. So, dealing first with the creation and the story we have of Adam and Eve in Genesis, what I'm going to do is first read a little bit out of the book it's called Myth and Legends by Neil Phillip, page 12. It's dealing with the Egyptian version of the creation. There was nothing but dark, endless ocean of none. All the elements of life were in the ocean, inert and senseless. Then the Lord without limit came into being and called himself Re. He was alone. And another name that you can put in there is Atum. And then it says, with his breath he created Shu, the air, and with his spittle he created Tefnut, moisture, and sent them across the water. Sent them out across the water. So already we see the whole idea of the breath. You know, it says with his breath he created, right? So then it says he caused the waters of noon to recede so that he had an island on which to stand. So you have the land coming out from the waters, like the waters being divided, and that's when land comes forth, right? Again, that sounds a lot like what we read in Genesis. Then it says, then he took thought in his heart of how things should be, and called forth from none all the plants, birds, and animals. He spoke their names, and they came into being. Okay? Keep all this in mind. And then it says, Shu and Tefnut had two children, Geb, the earth, and Nut, the sky. And it says, Nut lay on top of Geb, and the sky mated with the earth. It says, but Shu was jealous and wrenched the sky away, holding her aloft and pinning the earth down with his feet. It says the children of Nut and Geb were the stars, or the gods, if you want to say. Just some other details about the creation. It just says that the Banu bird flew across the waters. And I just brought that in because that kind of reminds me of in Genesis how it says the spirit is what went across the waters. And here you have the Banu bird doing that. And it's funny that the spirit that went across the waters is described in Christian tradition as the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit moved across the waters. And if you look at the New Testament, that same Holy Spirit is described as a bird or a dove. So first I'm going to go into the book Moses. It's called The Moses Mystery by Gary Greenberg. And I'm going to start at page 144. Egyptian literature has numerous references to a sole deity responsible for all of creation. And not infrequently, the texts often sound as if they were lifted from Hebrew prayer books. Sir Wallace Budge, a prominent Egyptologist in the early part of this century, collected several such expressions. Consider these examples. So this is some of the ways the Egyptians described the Creator. A lot like what we hear of the God of the Bible described as. Here's some descriptions. God is one and alone, and none existeth with him. God is the one who hath made all things. God is from the beginning, and he hath been from the beginning. He hath existed from of old, and was when nothing else had being. And another one is God is the eternal one. He is the eternal and infinite. and endureth forever. God himself is existence. He liveth in all things and liveth upon all things. So you can see some of the similarities in how God is described. Okay, so for a clear breakdown, I'm going to read something from an article this same person wrote, Gary Greenberg. It's called The Generations of the Heavens and of the Earth, Egyptian Deities in the Garden of Eden. Okay, it says the arrangement of events on day 2 seems to closely parallel the Heliopolitan creation myth. And it says Atum, through act of masturbatory sex, brought forth two deities, Shu and Tefnut, like we read, representing air and moisture. And it says these two deities gave birth to the male deity Geb, who represented the earth, and the female deity Nut, who represented the heavens. It says several Egyptian pictures portray Shu as lifting Nut into the air and separating her from Geb. Okay? Now, if you notice, a lot of people will read Genesis and they will think it's talking about two different creations of man. In other words, Adam wasn't the first created. And it does sort of imply that, how it's written, okay, in some ways. And according to this guy, there's a reason for that. God created the Adam out of the dust. Then he planted a garden and put the Adam in it. It says, observe here, 1, Adam appears before the plant life on day 3 and 2. And then it says that woman has not yet appeared. This is contrary to the sequence in the 7 days of creation, which places man and woman on the 6th day. It goes on to say, this arrangement strongly suggests that the man and woman created on day 6 were other than Adam and Eve, who appear earlier. The confusion arises from the fact that Adam and Eve originally represented Heliopolitan deities, the most important of whom was named Atum, a name virtually identical in pronunciation to the Semitic word Adam, which was used to describe the human male. So you see they're switching roles because they don't want to make Adam the deity like in the original myth we read from the Egyptian version, right? But what I'm going to show and what he's saying is, if you did put Adam and Eve in the role of the deities we read about, it would actually match up. So it says chronologically and contextually, we see that Genesis introduces Adam and Eve as the anthropomorphic beings referred to in Genesis 2:4 as heaven and earth. And since Adam is created out of the dust of the earth, we can equate him with the Egyptian deity Geb, or earth, and we can equate Eve with the Egyptian deity Nut, or heaven. So it says Eve enters the story, however, only after she is physically ripped from the body of Adam. In the Bible, it says this separation of Adam, the earth, from Eve, the heaven, closely parallels the Egyptian account in which Shu physically pulls heaven from earth. It also incorporates the Heliopolitan idea that a male and female deity were created from a single male deity. So those are all things that you can read in the Egyptian myth. Those are all elements. It says there are some other interesting parallels between Geb and Nut and Adam and Eve. Re, the chief deity, ordered Geb and Nut not to couple. They disobeyed his injunction and were punished. Re ordered Shu to separate the two bodies and declared that Nut would not be able to give birth on any day of the year. So that's one thing. Keep that in mind. Goes on to say that Nut, she had 5 children, one on each day, born in the following order: Osiris, Horus, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. The 3 males first, and then 2 females. And the Egyptians memorialized this sequence in their calendar. Goes on to say, because of the role of Geb and Nut in birthing these deities, they were often known as the father and mother of the gods. So it says, observe the sequence of events. It says the chief deity gives a direct command to heaven and earth. And look at the similarity with the Adam and Eve story. Gave a direct command and they violate the order. And as a penalty, the chief deity makes childbirth a difficult act for the female. Subsequently, she gives birth to three sons. And as we know from other Egyptian myths, one of those three sons, Set, kills one of the other sons, Osiris. Genesis has a similar plot. God gives Adam and Eve, or earth and heaven, a direct order. They disobey the order, and one of the punishments inflicted includes difficulty with childbirth. Eve gives birth to three named sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth, one of whom kills one of the other brothers. Also, Eve is identified in the Bible as the mother of all living, an identification similar to Nut's designation as mother of all gods. So as with Nut, Eve disobeys God, is punished with difficulty in childbirth, has three male sons, one of whom kills one of the others, and she is thought of as the first mother. It says, interestingly, the Hebrew name Seth and the Egyptian name Set are philologically identical, and both children are both third in sequence. Eve's third son is Seth, and then you have the third son of Nut being Set. So, however, as some will note, in the biblical sequence, it's not Seth who kills his brother. Instead, Cain does the killing. So, again, there's some differences, but you can see as far as the story itself, where it came from. Now, you have other myths in other cultures similar to this creation story. For example, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a Mesopotamian myth, it says, and this is from an article, Genesis and Gilgamesh Comparison. It says, there exist many similarities between Genesis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. One of those similarities is the use of a female figure as the cause of enlightenment between good and evil. This similarity is shown by the lines, and eat the food as it is custom of the land, from the Epic of Gilgamesh. In Genesis, Eve offered Adam the apple from the forbidden tree, and Adam ate it. Eating the apple exposed Adam and Eve to the good and evil that exists in the world. Similarly, the harlot's offering of the bread and wine eventually lead to Enkidu being enlightened of the good and evil that exists in the world, when previously he had only the instinct to survive. There is also a difference between the losses of paradise caused by a female figure. Eve was tricked into taking the apple from the forbidden tree by a snake. Her driving force in taking the apple and eating it was due to her curiosity to know whether God or the snake was right. The harlot was sent by Gilgamesh for the purpose of civilizing Enkidu. Now, the major factor in the harlot's success was her capability to take advantage of Enkidu's sexual urges. Remember that. And using it to gain his trust. And if you look into a goddess named Lilith, that type of theme can be connected to Lilith, another ancient concept or deity. Now, this is just from Wikipedia. Lilith is a figure in Jewish mythology, developed earliest in the Babylonian Talmud. Now, Lilith is connected to the female figure we just read in the Gilgamesh story, as well as other type of myths. And it says that Lilith is often envisioned as a dangerous demon of the night who is sexually wanton. And so if you look at the Talmud, and see there's other Jewish writings that the rabbis deal with. There were later writings that are mythology. But these rabbis, they'll use it along with what we call the Bible. And one of the things in it is it'll call Lilith, it'll describe a woman that was Adam's wife, and the name is Lilith that they use. This is pointing you to older mythology and older concepts. This is why I say the Bible is also not literal. It's myth. And a lot of rabbis will tell you that the Bible is not and was never supposed to be taken literal. It's metaphors that is really talking about deeper meanings and other concepts under the surface. Remember Lilith, because we're going to deal with Lilith a little bit later. So anyway, one of the things about Lilith is it was like Lilith was the serpent, like a female serpent deity. And this is why you always see pictures of the tree with the serpent wrapped around it in the Garden of Eden. This is all going to tie in later. You'll see what I mean later. But this is where that concept comes from, where you have a serpent wrapped around that tree that's deceiving people. The idea that the female is, that the fall of man is blamed on a female, that comes from that concept as well. Lilith can also be traced back to Pandora, like Pandora's box from the Greeks. Also blamed for the issues that women have as far as the issues with childbirth and menstruation. All that comes from these type of myths. Remember everything we talked about as far as the tree of life and all that, because that's going to come back. Okay, so you can see that the Adam and Eve story that had another origin. Okay, so I mentioned the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, around 2100 BC or so. Again, this is a Mesopotamian story, and you can see traces of the Noah story in that same epic, written way before the Bible was written. Now, this is the flood. This is the story of the flood in the same epic. It says, Utnapishtim, the only man to survive the great flood, and by the way, this is page 19 in Myths and Legends. The only man to survive the great flood sent by the gods had lived in the city of Shuruppak, where he served the god Ea. The city and the gods grew old, and the goddess Ishtar caused such strife among men that the gods could not sleep for the noise. So Enlil, god of earth, wind, and air, said, "Let us loose the waters on the world and drown them all." The gods agreed, but Ea warned Utnapishtim of the impending disaster in a dream and told him to build a boat and take on board 2 of every creature. For 7 nights the tempest raged until the entire world was covered in water. The boat ran aground on the top of Mount Nisir. We're going to get more into that with Moses, but remember that name, Mount Nisir, or Nisir, Nisi. To check the water level, Utnapishtim set free a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. See how it sounds exactly like the Noah story? But this is a whole different source, a whole different people outside of Israelites. They had the same story. And it said, when the raven did not return, Utnapishtim knew it had found a resting place, and the waters were subsiding. In thanks, he lit a fire to make a sacrifice to the gods. So you can see the Noah story was based on another myth. And you can see other Noah type stories in other cultures. I'm not getting too much into that. But what I want to do is get into Abraham next. And this is the thing I want to mention. I know that a lot of people, and I had some comments on this too, a lot of you are saying, well, of course those ancients had a concept of a Noah or an Adam and Eve or a Garden of Eden, because those are just altered versions of the real truth that we have in the Bible. In other words, they're just copying the real story, right? I thought that for years. So I understand. I thought the same thing. I'm talking about for years. But I'm going to tell you why I can't stand by that anymore. When we get into Jacob and Esau and Moses, you're going to see why I say that. Concerning Abraham and that sacrifice of Isaac, that's actually based on Osiris. A lot of what we're seeing in the sacrifice of Isaac deals with the Osiris funerary ritual, the whole concept of the resurrection of Osiris. So this is page 244 in the Moses Mystery. This story presents a number of problems. For one, it refers to Isaac and Abraham's only son, ignoring the existence of Ishmael, whom Abraham perhaps loved more than Isaac. More important, though, is the whole question of God asking for a human sacrifice and Abraham dutifully obeying. Both actors are out of character. Earlier in Genesis, when God told Abraham of the plan to destroy Sodom, Abraham argued and negotiated with the deity on behalf of the innocent people who would be killed. How could a man who argued with God about matters of justice not even raise a question about God's request for a human sacrifice, being that of his own son? And how could a God concerned with the taking of innocent life make such a request? Basically, it's saying, as far as the story not making sense as far as Abraham's character, how is it someone can argue for the lives of Sodom, but as soon as God tells him to sacrifice his son, there's no argument at all? Just bringing that up, something to think about. But then it goes on. It says, we should also take note of later midrashic tradition that holds that Abraham actually did kill Isaac in the original version of the story. Remember I mentioned the midrash. There's other Jewish writings that came about that rabbis still deal with to this day. One gives the story, it gives another version of the story where Isaac actually dies. I believe there's a reason for that, because it's getting you closer to the real myth that it's actually based on, and we'll get into that. So it goes on to say, it talks about the Osirian iconography and Isaac's sacrifice. It says, note, also in the traditional Jewish slaughter, one slits the throat, in effect separating head from body. God stopped Abraham's act at the last moment in the story in the Bible, right? Remember that? And it says, suddenly a ram appeared, and Abraham placed the ram in the fire. In sum, Isaac, like Osiris and the deceased Egyptian kings in imitation of Osiris, was about to have his head severed from his body, and his body passed through fire. And it says, a similar disruption of the sacrifice occurs in the Plutarch story when the Canaanite queen interrupts Isis as she passes the child through fire for the purpose of conferring immortality. This suggests the possibility that the interruption of Isaac's sacrifice may have also had an Egyptian source. That this event originally served as a funerary ritual related to Osiris' resurrection receives confirmation through the sudden appearance of the ram. Remember I told you about the hints and clues, so that ram is pointing you to something. It says, one of the most sacred animals in ancient Egypt, the ram of Mendes. In the Middle Kingdom, Egyptians identified it as the Ba, or soul, of Osiris. And I'll get more to that Ba when I get into the astrology aspect of it. But the Ba Nebjet, right? It says, after death, they thought the Ba of the deceased visited the tomb where its body lay. In the Isaac story, the ram, Osiris's Ba, which you can see in the pictures, it looks like a ram, okay? Osiris's Ba appears at the altar where the deceased is laid out as the soul of Isaac, Osiris in parentheses. It replaces Isaac on the funeral pyre. So there's a replacement at the last second. Basically, this is the whole death and rebirth concept. But instead of having it where Isaac is literally killed in the Abraham story, he's saved, but you do see that ram pop up. Just like when Osiris is reborn, he looks like a ram at that point. Now, dealing with the circumcision. Now, if you notice about circumcision, the Israelites weren't the only people to do circumcision. But according to the biblical story, God had circumcision specifically for Israel only, for a specific purpose based on Abraham. But yet, why is it that other cultures are doing it? So this is page 246. It goes on to say, he says, I suggest that the practice of circumcision is derived from Osirian ritual, and that its institution in the story of the birth of Isaac is because of Isaac's identification with Osiris. According to Herodotus, circumcision was originally practiced by the Egyptians, Ethiopians, and Colchians, the latter allegedly the remains of an Egyptian colony. He adds that the practice is also found among the Phoenicians and Syrians of Palestine, who he says admit that they learned of the practice from the Egyptians. Now he says through magic, in the myth, through magic, Isis created a substitute. Since it would be impractical, remember this is the rebirth of Osiris. She created a substitute, right? Since it would be impractical for Egyptians to remove the male organ, the idea of circumcision was developed, in which a piece of the male organ was cut off to symbolize that Osiris was less than whole. So he's saying that custom comes from the Osiris story. So we have a older concept of where the circumcision comes from. But it gets deeper than that. Now, page 209, Genesis has 3 stories about how a patriarch visiting a foreign king had his wife pretend to be his sister. 2 of the incidents involved Abraham and 1 involved Isaac. It says, despite the king's lack of knowledge about the deception, Abraham's God punished the Egyptian monarch and sent a plague to persecute the royal household. When Pharaoh learned the truth, he let Abraham and Sarah leave Egypt. After returning to Canaan, Abraham had a similar encounter with Abimelech, king of Gerar, a city outside of but near Egypt. In the incident, Genesis identifies the king as a Philistine and the captain of the Philistine army as a man named Phicol. This time before the king could sleep with Sarah, God appeared to him in a dream and warned of impending death if he consummated the relationship. And Abimelech returned Sarah to Abraham, and the 2 men made peace. So it says scholars generally agree that these 3 stories have a common source. Remember I said in the Bible you have stories that seem to repeat? That's what it's dealing with. The Isaac story, for example, and again, if you think about it, if it's really literal, what are the chances that these things keep happening the same way so many times? Now, one might be like, well, God can do that if he wants, but really, if you really look at it and think about it, wouldn't it be more probable that it's trying to give us a message or point us to another meaning underneath it? Just like another example is in the book of Jasher, you have Abraham going through the same scenario that Daniel went through. He was persecuted in Jasher by Nimrod, being threatened to put in a furnace the same way Daniel was. Again, what's the likelihood of it being the exact same scenario as David or as Daniel would be? Why is the story exactly the same? It's because both stories are based on another myth. And if you're already familiar with the myth, you can point that out. If you're already versed in that type of knowledge, you can key in on that. That's why I said this Bible is coded. It says, in support of Egypt as the original site, we note that the other 2 stories have Abraham and Isaac confronting a Philistine king with a Philistine army occupying a Philistine city in Canaan. But the Philistines didn't arrive in Canaan for more than 400 years after the Isaac incident, which suggests a very late editing of the sources by someone who was out of touch with the original version. So you can tell it's a later writing, because there shouldn't have been Philistines in that area or that region at the time, is what they're saying. What it says about the wife-sister issue in another book, the same author writes, is Bible Myth, African Origins of the Jewish People. It says, in the story of Isis in disguise, I believe we have a clue to the origins of the wife-sister stories in Genesis, he says. As you may recall, there are 3 instances in which the patriarch's wife pretends to be his sister instead of his wife. and the king wants a sexual relationship with the wife. It says, in the Egyptian myths, Isis is both wife and sister to Osiris and the mother of Horus. Set is the enemy of both her husband and her son and plans to kill both. He successfully murders Osiris, but due to Isis's protection, he fails in his efforts to kill Horus. Horus triumphs, and according to a number of Egyptian texts, he banishes Set to the desert area outside of Egypt. So Set is banished to the desert, which also reminds me of the Azazel or Azazel story in Enoch, the evil angel that was banished to the desert and then put in Sheol and whatnot. But and also the story with Hagar being sent in the desert. Okay, but anyway, it says the desert territory ruled by Set corresponds to the desert wilderness of Shur on the northeast corner of the Egyptian border. So that's dealing with Set. It's related to the Set story. It is also the site of Gerar, the city where two of the three wife-sister stories take place. And it occurs in Egypt. And that's another thing. Why is it always occurring in Egypt? It just happened to be in Egypt. Why? Because that's a hint. Because it's pointing you to an Egyptian myth.